Hello. Today I'm going to talk about resilience and the extraordinary adaptations of extreme conditions. Now, when you typically think of resilience, you think of overcoming or like an incident happening which taught you something, like a lesson or something. Well, I'm going to read, within my script here, growing up in extreme human conditions from my personal view. And I want to share that with the audience, and you tell me what you think or not think, whatever. When I talk about resilience, I want to be clear about something from the start. I didn't grow up learning how to be strong, I grew up learning how to survive. Strength came later, reflection came later, and the meaning came later. In the beginning, there was only adaptation. There was only the quiet, daily process of adjusting to instability. So consistently that it stopped feeling unusual. That is what extreme human conditions do to you. They normalize what should have never been normal, and they teach you lessons long before you're ready to understand them. I experienced homelessness at a young age. My siblings and I lived in cars at times near a riverbank, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a way of life. There was no clear timeline for when things would improve. There was no sense of permanence. Every environment felt provisional. You learn early in those conditions not to get too attached to the places or expectations because everything feels temporary. That kind of instability shapes how long your mind works. It teaches you to stay alert and to stay flexible and to never fully relax. My father was incarcerated and he struggled with addiction and had repeated run ins with the law. His absence was both physical and emotional, and the chaos surrounded his life bled into ours whether we wanted it to or not. My mother became the caretaker and the gravity of our family. She carried the responsibility of survival on her shoulders, doing whatever she had to do to keep us fed, clothed, and together. Watching her taught me something very important. That something that looks like exhaustion, sometimes it looks like persistence without recognition. Poverty wasn't an abstract idea to me, it wasn't a statistic or a policy discussion. It was a practical and immediate. It was wearing the same clothes to school multiple days in a row. It was noticing the looks from the other kids before anyone said anything. It was understanding without explanation that certain opportunities were simply not available, but not in practice. You learn to stop asking for what you already know you can't have. That's another quiet adaptation people don't talk about. School was not a refuge, it was another place where difference was visible. Being poor is something people notice even when they don't have the language for it. Kids can sometimes be vulnerable, or I'm sorry, being poor is something people notice even when they don't have the language for it. Kids can sense vulnerability and they often respond to it with cruelty before they understand empathy. I was bullied and I was excluded, I was outcast, and the rundown. And that stays with you, and just the behavior, it's internalization. You begin to see yourself through the lens of how you're treated. You start questioning your own worth before you even understand what worth is supposed to mean. What made all this more complex is that the addiction wasn't something happening for far away from me, it was all around me. Drugs were part of my environment. Dysfunction was familiar, and the behaviors and the instability and the emotional volatility, it all blended into the background and the noise of life. When you grow up in that kind of environment, you don't immediately recognize it as abnormal. It's just what it is. And that's where adaptation begins, not consciously, but subconsciously. Somewhere in all that, my mind made a choice. Before I knew I was choosing to become observant, instead of fully absorbing what I was surrounded by, I started watching it. I watched what the addiction did to people. I watched how quickly things could fall apart, and I watched how pain, when it wasn't confronted, found other ways out: anger, escapism, self destruction. I didn't have the vocabulary for it at the time, but I was learning cause and effect. I was learning pattern recognition. At 37 years of age, I've never been addicted to drugs. That's not something I say to separate myself from anyone else. It's something I say because it matters to the story of adaptation. I didn't avoid addiction because I was altered from it. I avoided it because I saw it clearly. I saw the cost and I saw the loss of agency. I saw how quickly it erased people's futures. And even as a kid, I understood something simple but powerful. Escape always comes with a price. That awareness became one of my earliest survival tools. Now, unfortunately, I can't say that for my siblings. My mother and father grew up with addiction. Well, they were addicts, and that bled into my siblings as well. And although they have recovered and are on the other side, like I said, when I grew up with it, my sisters, my brother, basically my whole family has dealt with this addiction issue, whether it's substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, you name it. Living in poverty and instability also changes how you relate to control. When so much of your life feels out of your hands, you start looking for the few things you can control. For me, that became behavior, discipline, self restraint, not because anyone taught me those values explicitly, but because they felt like anchors to an unpredictable world. Control didn't mean dominance, it meant survival. It meant reducing risk wherever possible that I could reduce it. There's another side of growing up this way that people don't acknowledge. It forces maturity long before emotional development can catch up. You carry responsibility early. You become aware of adult problems before you have adult tools. And that mismatch creates tension inside you. You're expected to endure things you don't fully understand, and you do it quietly because there's no alternative. Complaining doesn't help the situation. Breaking down doesn't fix anything, so you learn to hold on to it together, not heroically, but practically. What I didn't realize at the time is that the adaptations were shaping my identity, not in obvious ways, but in subtle ones. I learned to read rooms, I learned to assess risks, and I learned to stay emotionally guarded. I learned that stability is rare and must be protected when it appears. These aren't traits you choose, they're traits that emerge when your environment demands them. This is what extraordinary adaptation looks like in extreme human conditions. It's not dramatic, it's not incremental, it's psychological. And I'm not by no means saying that I have had it so bad, boo hoo me. There's plenty of people out there that's had it far worse than me. I'm just implementing my own life into the topic that we're discussing. Just to be 100 with everybody. When survival becomes your baseline, joy becomes unfamiliar and relaxation feels unsafe. You stay alert even when there's nothing immediate to be alert for. These adaptations keep you alive, but they also shape how you move through the world long after the original threat is gone. And I face with this still as of today. It's still a struggle for me. At the time, I wasn't thinking about the future. I was thinking about getting through the day, the week, the year. Long term planning doesn't come naturally when the present feels unstable. Still, something important was forming beneath the surface, like the motivation to keep going, not the kind that gets applause, but the kind that allows you to keep going without external validation. I didn't expect life to be fair, and I didn't expect health to or help to arrive. I didn't expect recognition. I was lucky to have people in my life that would help me and did notice some stuff and would offer a helping hand or whatever. By no means am I saying that it was all me or, you know, Looking back now, I understand that this period of my life wasn't just about suffering, it wasn't about collaboration. My nervous system, my psychology, my expectations were being tuned to reality as it was not as I wished it to be. That doesn't mean it was healthy. And it wasn't healthy in every way. It means it's adaptive, and adaptation is extreme conditions is the first stage of the resilience that I'm talking about. This is where the story really begins, not with the triumph, not with the clarity, but with the endurance which a child learning how to exist inside instability without collapsing, with the mind quietly taking notes even when it doesn't know why, with a foundation being built not out of comfort but out of necessity. This is the origin of the gift of resilience, not the polished version, the raw one, the one forged before there was language for it. Part two, we're going to be talking about the survival of psychology and the extraordinary adaptation, which also continues throughout my story. That survival doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a moment where you realize you're adapting in that ways that will shape you for decades. It happens quietly through repetition, through exposure, through the slow conditioning of the nervous system to environments that never fully let their guard down. When you grow up in extreme human conditions, survival psychology becomes your default operating system. Long before you're long before you understand what psychology even is, in my world, chaos wasn't an interpretation, it was a baseline. Addiction, instability, emotional volatility, and uncertainty blended into a constant background hum. When that's what surrounds you, your mind begins to prioritize awareness over innocence. You learn to stay alert, and you learn to read a tone before words. You learn to anticipate shifts in mood and environments because doing so reduces risks. This isn't paranoia, it's a pattern recognition driven by the necessity. I didn't consciously decide to become hyper aware. It happened because awareness had value. Awareness meant safety, and it meant knowing when to stay quiet, when to pull back, and when to move. Over time, this kind of awareness becomes internalized. Your body learns before your mind does. Your nervous system adapts to unpredictability by staying engaged even when nothing obvious is happening. That's one of the earliest extraordinary adaptations, constant vigilance with conscious effort. At the same time, I learned something equally important: restraint. When you grow up around addiction, you see what happens when restraint disappears. You see how quickly impulses can take over and how short term relief becomes long term damage. I watched people reach for substances not because they were weak, but because they were overwhelmed. Pain was constant and escape was available. That combination is dangerous even as a kid. I understand that. Once escape becomes the primary coping mechanism, control seems to be slipping away. So instead of escape, I learned containment. I learned how to hold discomfort without releasing it outward. I learned how to sit with tension. I learned how to delay gratification, not because I was disciplined by choice, but because I needed to trust my impulse. The distrust wasn't moral, it was practical. I had seen that impulse cost, and that observation shaped my relationship with risk in a way that stayed with me. This is something people often misunderstood about resilience. They think it's about toughness, about pushing through pain and refusing to feel. But resilience, at least in its early stages, is about regulation. It's about managing internal chaos when external chaos is unavoidable. I didn't have control over where I lived, the adults around me, or the stability of my environment. But I could control my reactions. I could control my choices, and the sense of control, however small, was stabilizing. Over time, this eternal regulation became part of my identity. I became the observer, the one who noticed patterns, the one who thought ahead. I wasn't the loudest or the most visible, but I was attentive. I paid attention to the outcomes. I noticed what behaviors led to stability and which ones led to collapse. When you grow up like this, life becomes a long case study in cause and effect. By the time I reached adulthood, these adaptations were already deeply ingrained. I didn't see I didn't see them as skills. I saw them as a normal, constant self-monitoring, which felt natural. Emotional distance felt protective. Independence felt necessary. I didn't rely easily on others, not because I didn't want connection, but because reliance had always felt risky. Stability had been fragile, trust had been conditioned, so my psychology adapted accordingly. There is a cost that, of course, survival psychology keeps you alive, but it also limits vulnerability. You learn how to function without asking for help. Like I said, I've asked for help and I have received help from people. I was fortunate in that aspect, and plus I had others, and not that my parents weren't there. Well, my dad wasn't a lot of times, but my mom was always there, and she always found a way to make stuff work. What made these adaptations extraordinary wasn't that they were unique, it's that they worked. I stayed out of trouble, I stayed clear of addiction, I made deliberate choices even when they were difficult. I didn't self destruct in environments where self destruction was common. What doesn't make me exceptional, it makes me adaptive. And adaptation under extreme conditions is a real marker of resilience. That's in my opinion. Another key aspect of survival psychology is the expectations management. I didn't expect life to be easy, fair, and I didn't expect outcomes to align with efforts in the short term. I experienced resistance and I experienced setbacks, and because of that, disappointment didn't destabilize me the way it does for other people who grew up buffered from reality. When things went wrong, it confirmed that I already understood life is unpredictable and progress is rarely linear. This expectations didn't make me cynical, and it made me patient. Patient is often misunderstood as passivity, but in my case it was endurance. It was the ability to keep moving forward without needing constant reassurance. Not that I didn't ask have I needed not that I didn't need reassurance in my life. I did. I'm very sure of that. I wasn't waiting for permission and I wasn't waiting for the validation. I was focused on just living and surviving. As I got older, I began to realize that my mind had been shaped by necessity in ways that gave me both advantages and limitations. I could stay calm under pressure and I could handle uncertainty. Not that it was easy, and it was really freaking difficult at times, but I could make decisions without emotional collapse. But I also struggled to relax and I struggled to trust ease. When you grow up in chaos, peace can feel unfamiliar, even suspicious. This is where extraordinary adaptation comes complicated. The same traits that help you survive can prevent you from living life if they go unexamined. Constant vigilance can become anxiety, and emotional restraint can become disconnection. Independence can become isolation. These adaptations are not mistakes, they are unfinished processes. They require evolution once the environment changes. And like I said, till this day, I still am going through stuff in life that I'm not sure how to say it, but it still affects me today. At the same time, though, I wasn't thinking about refinement, I was thinking about staying on track, about not repeating the patterns, about not becoming another statistic. That awareness, the awareness of what to do, was one of my strongest motivators. I didn't need a clear picture of success. I had a very clear picture of failure, and that clarity mattered. Survival psychology teaches you boundaries long before you can articulate them, and I've learned where I didn't want to end up. I learned what behaviors to avoid, and I learned to question impulses instead of following them. This wasn't fear based, and it was informed. It came from watching consequences unfold again and again in my life. Looking back now, I can see that this phase of my life was about consolidation. My mind was taking the raw material of early experiences and turning them into a framework. Values were forming, not idealistic ones, but functional ones: stability, responsibility, and self control. Awareness, there wasn't abstract virtues, they were tools. And speaking of tools, that's the core of extraordinary adaptation in extreme human conditions. You don't become who you want to be, you become who you need to be. You become what the environment demands. The question that comes later is whether you can go beyond that version of yourself when survival is no longer the primary goal. And that question, whether resilience can transform into something more than just endurance, is where the next part of this story begins. By the time I was old enough to reflect on my life in any meaningful way, my expectations were already set, not by optimism or ideology, but experience. Expectations form early when you grow up in extreme human conditions. They don't come from what you're told life should be, they come from what it consistently shows you. And in my case, life showed me instability, inconsistency, and consequence long before it showed me comfort and reward. I didn't grow up expecting fairness. I didn't grow up expecting rescue. And I didn't grow up expecting that effort would automatically translate into outcomes. That might sound bleak, but it wasn't. It was grounding. It meant that when things didn't work out, I wasn't disoriented, and I wasn't shocked or disappointed. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like confirmation, and what I already understood: life is complex, uneven, and even indifferent and to intention. Those expectations shaped how I moved through the world, and I learned to prepare instead of hope. I learned to anticipate instead of assume, and I learned to think several steps ahead, not because I was strategic by nature, but because of uncertainty, which had trained me to be. When you don't have safety net, foresight becomes essential. You don't rely on best case scenarios. You plan around the worst case ones. One of the most important adaptations I developed was pattern recognition. Growing up surrounded by addiction, instability, and social exclusion gives you a front row seat to cause and effect. I watched how certain choices led to predictable outcomes. I watched how unresolved pain showed up again and again in different forms: substance abuse and the aggression, avoidance of or self sabotage. I also watched how discipline and restraint, consistency through the visible, produced stability over time. These observations weren't intellectual exercises, they were survival lessons. I wasn't analyzing the behavior out of curiosity, and I was trying to avoid repeating it. I paid attention to who ended up trapped and who managed to move forward. I noticed how small decisions compounded, and I noticed how multiple justified their behavior and how those justifications slowly hardened into identity. That awareness became quite a compass. Expectations management also shaped my emotional world. When you don't expect ease, you don't panic when things are difficult. You don't take hardship as evidence that sometimes something is wrong with you. Instead, you as part of a terrain that perspective came gave that the perspective gave me the resilience long before I knew the word. It allowed me to persist without constant reassurance, and I didn't need life to make sense. I needed it to be navigatable. At the same time, the way of thinking created distance between me and people who grew up differently. I often felt out of sync with peers who expected immediate results, recognition, or fairness. Their frustration puzzled me not because it was invalid, but because it came from expectations I didn't share. I had learned to measure progress over long spans of time. I had learned to accept delayed outcomes. The patience wasn't virtuous, it was adaptive. Awareness, however, cuts both ways. When you become skilled at reading patterns, you also become aware of risks that others ignore. You see how easily things can unravel, and you understand how fragile stability really is. That awareness can keep you grounded, but it can also keep you guarded. Trust doesn't come easily when you've seen how quickly people or systems can fail. This is where my internal world became more complex. I wasn't just navigating external challenges, I was managing an internal narrative shaped by scarcity. I valued this ability deeply because I had lived with it. I valued control because I had experienced the absence, and while those values served me well, they also shaped my sense of possibility. I didn't dream expansively and I aimed pragmatically. Survival had taught me to minimize risk before maximizing my potential. One of the hardest realizations I came to later in life is the expectations formed in hardship can outlive their usefulness. They protect you early on, but they can limit yourself when you're left unexamined. When you expect struggle, you may unconsciously design a life around endurance rather than fulfillment. You become comfortable carrying the weight even when you no longer need to. But before the realization came awareness of myself, awareness of my own coping mechanisms. I began noticing how often I defaulted to self reliance even when support was available. I noticed how I stayed emotionally reserved, how I anticipated problems before they existed, and how I rarely allowed myself to relax fully. These behaviors weren't flaws, they were strategies that had worked for a long time for me. Pattern recognition eventually turned inward. I started seeing how my past shaped my present, and I began asking different questions. Not just how do I avoid failure, but what kind of life am I building? The shift didn't happen at once, it happened slowly, and stability replaced chaos, and space opened up for reflection. And I'm still going through that somewhat. Understanding the expectations become a turning point. I realized that I had been living according to rules formed by my environment that no longer existed. The world I grew up in required vigilance and restraint. The world I was moving into required something different: flexibility, trust, and the willingness to redefine success. The realization was uncomfortable. Letting go of the survival habits feel risky. Not forgetting, but letting them go. The habits feels risky even when survival is no longer the primary threat. What experience has taught me is that resilience is not statistics, it's developmental. The expectations that help you survive one phase of your life must be reassessed and the next. Otherwise, you end up living according to outdated rules. This is where growth becomes intentional rather than reactive. Looking back, I can see how deeply expectations shaped my identity. It kept me grounded and it kept me disciplined. It kept me from repeating cycles I didn't want to inherit. But it also kept my world small for a long time. Recognizing the duality was the beginning of new adaptation, not survival, but evolution. This is a moment where resilience starts asking a different question. Not about how do I endure, but how do I expand without losing what kept me from being alive, or kept me alive, essentially. The question doesn't have to be an easy answer, and it doesn't have to be resolved so quickly. But it marks a shift from endurance to intentional growth. And the shift leads directly into the next phase of the story: learning how to grow beyond survival without abandoning the strength that survival gave me. There comes a point in life where survival stops being primary threat, but your mind doesn't immediately get the message. The environment changes, but the internal systems you built to endure the old stay online. That was one of the most disoriented phases of my life, realizing that the same adaptations that once protected me were now quietly limiting me. Survival had done its job, but it wasn't meant to be permanent. For most of my life, my identity has been shaped around endurance. I knew how to function under pressure, and I knew how to carry weight without complaint. I knew how to stay disciplined, self contained, and alert. Those traits had kept me out of trouble and away from addiction. They had given me stability where we had once been chaos. But as stability became more consistent, something unexpected happened. The skills that once felt like strength started to feel heavy. I noticed at first in my nervous system, even in calm situations, I stayed tense. Even when things were going well, I was waiting for disruption. Relaxation felt unfamiliar, almost unsafe. When you grow up in instability, your body learns to associate calm with vulnerability. You stay ready because readiness once meant survival. Letting go of that readiness felt like a risk I wasn't sure I was able to take. Hyperindependence was another adaptation that needed examination. I had learned early not to rely on anyone, not because I didn't value connection, but because reliance had never felt stable. Depending on others meant exposure, so I became capable, self sufficient, internally reinforced. But every time that independence turned into distance, I didn't ask for help when it was appropriate. I didn't share my uncertainty. I handled everything alone because that's what I have always done. Rewriting or rewiring identity requires honesty, and honesty is uncomfortable when it challenges the version of yourself that kept you alive. I had to acknowledge that some of my resilience was rooted in fear, not fear in the dramatic sense, but fear in regression, fear of losing ground, and fear of becoming what I had worked so hard not to. That fear had motivated me, but it had also narrowed my world. Another survival trait without which required attention was my emotional restraint. I had learned to contain my emotions and to regulate internally to avoid outward displays that might create instability. That skill was essential growing up. But as an adult, it has made intimacy difficult. It made vulnerability feel foreign. And I couldn't articulate ideas, analyze experiences, and speak about hardships, but actually feeling openly without control felt unsafe. This is a part of resilience people rarely talk about. We celebrate endurance, but we don't talk about what happens when endurance becomes identity. We don't talk about how the survival traits can turn into walls. Letting go of these walls doesn't feel like growth at first. It feels like exposure, and when you're spent your lifetime minimizing your exposure, feels dangerous, even when it isn't. Growth beyond survival required me to reassess what control meant. Control had once meant safety, now it meant limitation. I had to learn that everything needed to be anticipated, contained, or managed. Some things needed to be experienced. The shifts didn't happen through single realization, it happened through repeated discomfort, through moments where I allowed myself to trust outcomes instead of predicting them, through relationships that challenged my guardedness, through opportunities that required expansion rather than caution. Excuse me. Rewiring identity is not about easing the past, it is about integrating it. I didn't want to lose the discipline, awareness, and restraint that resilience had given me. I wanted to refine them to make them tools instead of reflexes. That meant slowing down, reflecting, asking myself why I reacted in the way that I did, and assuming it was necessary. One of the most important questions I learned to ask myself was, is this response still serving me, or is it just familiar? Familiar can masquerade as wisdom when you've lived in a mode for too long. Survival habits feel right because they're known, not because they're optimal. Learning to tell the difference took time. This phase of growth has forced me to confront my grief for childhood I didn't have for the ease I never experienced for a version of myself that had grew up too fast. I had survived by not dwelling on those losses, but healing required acknowledgement, not bitterness, not blame, just recognition you can't fully move forward without honoring what you've carried. As my identity began to shift, so did my definition of strength. Strength was no longer just endurance, it was adaptability. It was emotional honesty. It was the ability to remain grounded. It was staying guarded. That kind of strength is quieter, but it is deeper. It allows you to build rather than just withstand. The stage of life taught me that resilience has phases. First, it protects you, then, it stabilizes you, and finally, if you let it, it transforms you. Transformation requires intention, and it requires letting go of the idea of suffering as the source of your value. You don't have to keep proving how much you can carry. Rewiring identity is meant redefining success. Success wasn't just staying out of trouble and avoiding addiction anymore. It became about alignment, about living in a way that reflected cautious choices rather than conditioned responses. The shift didn't ease my past, it gave it direction. By the end of the phase, I wasn't just surviving, I was building a life informed by experience, but not confined by it. It was that stage for the final evolution of resilience and purpose. There is a moment in every life shaped by extreme conditions where survival stops being the question and responsibility takes its place. Not responsibility in the sense of obligation, but responsibility in the sense of direction. Once you understand what you've endured, once you recognize the adaptations that kept you alive, you face with a deeper choice whether you were simply live after survival or whether you will use or you live after survival or you simply um, you use what survival taught you to shape something meaningful. For a long time, my goal was simple, but became one that I was growing up. Don't fall into addiction. Don't repeat chaos. Don't disappear into the same cycles that trapped so many people around me. The goal served me well, and it gave me boundaries. It gave me discipline, but avoidance is not purpose. It's starting up. It's a starting point, not a destination. To at some point what I'm not going to be had to evolve into what I am going to build. The realization didn't arrive with certainty, it arrived with quite pressure. A sense that simply staying upright wasn't enough anymore. The clarity I had gone through with the hardship carried a responsibility with it. When you grow up inside systems that fail people, you see things others don't. You notice patterns others overlook and you understand consequences, and that is theory, but that's a lived reality, the kind of understanding that demands expression. Becoming the interruption means choosing to break the cycle not just privately but visibly. It means refusing to normalize what nearly destroyed you. It means speaking honestly about the costs of instability, addiction, and poverty without romanticizing or explaining them. For me, it meant using my voice to articulate truths I learned the hard way. Truths about discipline, self control, and conscious choices in a world often rewarded distraction and escape. Legacy is often misunderstood. People think it's about status, wealth, and recognition. For someone like me, legacy is simpler and heavier at the same time. It's proving that environments don't get the final say. It's showing that extraordinary adaptations forged in extreme human conditions can become tools for insight rather than sources of damage. It's demonstrating that breaking a cycle doesn't require perfection, it requires consistency. I didn't emerge from my past untouched. I carried the marks of it. I carried the heightened awareness of skepticism, the deep respect stability that only comes from living without it. But instead of seeing these as scars, I've learned to see them as information. They shape how I think, how I question, how I engage with the world, and they keep me grounded and they keep me honest. Purpose for me is not about pretending I rose above my circumstances effortlessly. It's about acknowledging the cost and still choosing to move forward consciously. It's about refusing to let pain be wasted, and pain, when examined instead of avoided, becomes perspective. Perspective becomes discernment. Discernment becomes responsibility, and responsibility, when acted upon, becomes an impact. I also understand how the becoming of an interruption doesn't mean rejecting where I came from. It means contextualizing it, honoring the strength it took to endure without allowing the endurance to harden into bitterness. I don't speak from a place of resentment, I speak from a place of clarity. I know what happens when people don't have options, support, or models of healthy coping. I lived it, and that lived knowledge carries weight. One of the most important lessons resilience taught me is the identity is not static. You are not forever the product of your worst circumstances. You're also not obligated to remain the version of yourself that survival created. Growth means allowing yourself to become more than what was necessary at the time. It means expanding your sense of possibility without denying the reality that shaped you. Becoming the becoming the interruption also means resisting simplification. My story doesn't fit nearly into a success narrative, and I don't want it to. It's complex and layered. It includes contradictions that honestly matters because road resilience is messy. It's not a straight line, it's included setbacks, recalibrations, and periods of uncertainty. What defines it is not perfection but persistence with awareness. As I look at my life now, I see continuity. Instead of contrast, the same discipline that kept me away from the addiction now fuels intentional living. The same awareness that helped me navigate chaos now allows me to question systems and narratives critically. The same endurance that carried me through instability now supports long term visions. Nothing was wasted. It was all preparation, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. Purpose doesn't mean having all the answers, and it means committing to asking better questions. It means using your experiences not as a shield, but as a lens. For me, that lens reveals how fragile people's lives can be when systems fail, and how powerful individuals' choice becomes in the absence of the guarantees. It also reveals how easily cycles continue when no one interrupts them. This is why I speak. This is why I reflect publicly, not to position myself above anyone else, but to articulate that survival art actually teaches when it's examined honestly. My life is not an exception, it's an example that becomes possible when adaptation is followed by reflection, and reflection is followed by the intention. The gifts of resilience is not what I endured, it was what I learned, and learning, when acted upon, creates legacy. Resilience is not about being unthinkable or unbreakable. It's not about shaped without being erased. My life began in conditions that statistically predicted failure, addiction, and indivisibility, but statistics don't account for awareness or discipline or choice. Through extraordinary adaptation, consciously reflection, and deliberate growth, I transformed not more survival, but I transformed my misfortunes, I would say, into understanding, and understanding into purpose. If my story proves anything, it's this: where you start matters far less than how consciously you move forward. Pain can either harden you or sharpen you, and the difference is choice. Growth isn't loud, transformation isn't instant, but purpose is built layer by layer through deliberate action and honest self examination. And if this message resonated with you, if you navigate pressure, change, or rebuilding yourself from the inside out, then you're not alone and you're in the right place. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep these conversations going. This channel is about the clarity and resilience and seeing the world and yourself without filters. Thank you and have a good day.